Welcome, everyone. My name is Litzy Baeza. I use the pronouns she and her. I'm located in Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton, Alberta. I just want to thank all of the participants for coming along on this learning journey. My role at the Women's Economic Council is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Adult Education Specialist. So really happy that you've had a chance to go through all of these courses. The goal of today's lesson is to dive deeper into a few different communication styles and look at why or what is important about communication. We're also going to be looking at self-advocacy and what that might look like, particularly for folks from the equity deserving groups. We know that these groups are the ones that face more barriers and challenges, so self-advocacy, self-care might look different for everyone. In my quest to decolonize and be authentic and genuine in things such as the land acknowledgement, I want to share a video today that really speaks about the land, the relationship of the land to the people by someone from an Indigenous community.
Acknowledgement of the land. It's not about acknowledging whose land it belongs to, because that indigenous worldview, we never owned the land. We're simply caretakers of it for future generations. And what I've been taught from my elders is that when we do that acknowledgement of the land, it's much more than just the territory. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people that share the land. It's our relationships with Mother Earth, their relationships with the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, the crawlers, the original stewards of Mother Earth. It's that relationship that we acknowledge with trees. It's that acknowledgement that we have with plant life that is part of the food chain and helps us exist. It gives us our medicines for healing, gives us food for nutrients, it gives us our medicines for ceremonies. We acknowledge water. Water is sacred, water is life. What we're told is that when we acknowledge that water, that we always have to acknowledge the carriers of those teachings, which are the women. So we do that in the same voice. We also acknowledge the infinite wisdom of the grandfathers. Then we take that to that next level, is which acknowledging that relationship that we have with father son, or in some nations brother son. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with Nokomis, Grandma Moon, and how she cleanses Mother Earth. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with our distant relations, the star people. So when we talk about acknowledging the land, it's so much more so than just acknowledging what nation was on that. As we know throughout the history of Turtle Island, is that Indigenous people were, for the most part, nomadic people. They shifted. They would move from season to season. It just so happens that Sheridan sits on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which I'm very proud to always share and educate with people. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that many, many other nations had walked this territory, and that their ancestors are still here amongst us.
All right. So what are the learning objectives for today? Well, we're going to be looking at how to develop inclusive and effective communication skills, or what that looks like, really. This is very introductory type of material. It gives you an idea of ways to be inclusive, but it's also important that you also educate yourself and do a deeper dive. We're also going to be looking at what self-advocacy means, practicing self-care, boundary setting, and celebration of growth. And my colleague Zanna will be doing that part of the workshop. All right, what's important to note, and there's been lots of research that has been done, particularly around communication. Research has found that about 90% of communication really is nonverbal, and 10% is verbal. So while you may think you are understanding, or someone is understanding what is coming out of your mouth, you might be paying attention to subtle nonverbal cues that they're portraying, right? Maybe slouching. That might mean they're disinterested to you. And we also have to take note of all the varying types of nonverbal communication that exist, particularly when we talk about culture. So let's look at these influences that verbal and nonverbal can have on communication. So verbal styles such as intonation, volume, tone can play a part in communication. For example, if someone speaks in a high intonation, it might mean something different to what we may understand as excitement or shock in some cases. We have seen as well that sometimes language proficiency plays a big part in communication and the ability to understand someone or not. Nonverbal communication is the transmission of messages or signals through a nonverbal platform such as eye contact, facial expressions, gestures, posture, the distance between two individuals, for example. It includes the use of visual cues such as body language, distance, and that of physical environments, of voice and of touch. It can also include the use of time and eye contact, and the actions of looking while talking and listening, frequency of glances, patterns of fixation, etc. We know here in Canada, for example, if we don't look at someone in the eye or there's no eye contact, a lot of times we look at that as mistrust or disrespect. While in certain cultures, such as Japan and a lot of Asian cultures, for example, eye contact or direct eye contact is a form of disrespect. And so a lot of times folks from those cultures will not look at you in the eyes, particularly if you belong higher up in the hierarchy. The study of nonverbal communication started in 1872 with Charles Darwin. Darwin began to study nonverbal communication as he noticed the interactions between animals such as lions, tigers, dogs, etc., and realized they also communicated by gestures and expressions. For the first time, nonverbal communication was studied and its relevance questioned. Today, scholars argue that nonverbal communication can convey more meaning than verbal communication. Some scholars state that most people trust forms of nonverbal communication over verbal communication. Nonverbal communication strengthens a first impression in common situations, such as attracting a partner or a business interview. Impressions are on average formed within the first 4 seconds of contact. And that's why it's important as well to question your first impressions, right? Because bias can play a big part in that. For example, many indigenous cultures use nonverbal communication in the integration of children at a young age into their cultural practices. Children in these communities learn through observing and pitching in, through which nonverbal communication is a key aspect of observation. Other aspects of nonverbal communication styles you can see on the screen, such as greetings, the use of silence, gestures, body movements, and so on. For example, in a culture like Japan, the use of silence is appropriate and welcome. And when that silence is broken in a meeting or a classroom, it is looked upon as disrespectful. All right, so as we saw on the screen before, when with nonverbal communication comes other types of body language, such as gestures. What you see on the screen, and maybe pause here so you can take notes or read through the list, are common forms of gestures around the world. So I teach cultural intelligence at a college here in Edmonton, Alberta. And, I've been teaching it for about 8 years. And the students, for their final research paper, a lot of times will write about gestures. And I'm so amazed at the amount of gestures that are so common, that exist around the world. So if you want to learn more about gestures, there's lots of videos on YouTube and there's lots of information online. So, one example that I always use in some of my courses around intercultural communication is one about a US president. I won't name him, but it just speaks to why it is so important, right, to do that cultural background research, right, to understand that intercultural practice, particularly when you're doing business. A US president had gone to Brazil for a business trip, and as he got off the plane, he did one of these. And here in Canada and most North American cultures, this means okay, right? Or that's good. But in Brazil, that means F off. And so this is why it's so important to really understand the culture that you're going to go work in, study in, do business in, right? Because sometimes you might not understand those gestures. All right. The other important piece about communication is the idea of direct and indirect communication. And this really describes the different styles individuals use to express themselves. Direct communication is a communication style where their speakers say what they want. Where the speaker says what they want simply and straightforwardly. Indirect communication is a style where the speaker uses more subtle means. They may use body language, gestures, tone of voice, facial expressions to hint at their expectations, but not directly state them. Here are some ways in which direct and indirect communication differ. Word choice. A direct communicator usually uses simple and unambiguous words. Indirect communicators tend to use vaguer language and often use words such as perhaps or maybe. In China, for example, there are 50 different ways to say no. So you will never hear someone say no. They might say maybe, they might say perhaps, but they're hinting towards no. The famous Indian bob, for example, we don't really know if this is a yes or no. And when I talk to Indian students in my classes, a lot of the times they will say to me, it means perhaps, it means maybe, it could mean a variety of different things. Interpretation. Direct communication styles are simpler to interpret because the speaker clearly expresses their intentions. An audience may misinterpret what an indirect communicator says because they leave the audience to infer much of what they mean. Now, when you look at cultures that are collectivist, right, that are formed on relationships and social networks, they know each other. So they can easily infer what is meant. But if you have no relationship to the person, it will be very difficult for you to understand what the other person is saying, or what if they're relying on you to interpret what they're saying. Conflict resolution. Direct communicators can reach a resolution quicker because they say exactly what they think. Conflict resolution can be more complex with indirect communicators because the speakers don't clearly state their needs. And this can become problematic in the workplace, as you can imagine, right? Particularly when it comes to different cultures. If you're saying something direct and the other person is not talking direct to you, there might be a lot of room for misinterpretation, right? Another important piece to communication is around the idea of inclusive and equitable communication and language. As we move to advance equity and inclusion in our workplaces, it is really important that we ensure we are as inclusive as we can be when it comes to this piece. On the screen, you will see a few rules and tips along with examples. It's important you do your own education around what it means to be inclusive in your language and communication. It should not be the work of equity deserving groups to educate you. So that's really important. Avoid reinforcing power structures or stereotypes. Choose words carefully to not imply superiority or inferiority or reinforce false beliefs or normalcy that contributes to marginalization. Note the powerful shift in saying the global majority instead of visible minority, for example. And please note that the government of Canada, so visible minority does come from the federal government, particularly in their use of the census. There is a move, and they have asked for input from the Canadian public about the word visible minority, and so there is a move to change it. Educate yourself on current best practices and adapt to evolving language. Consult people with lived experiences and integrate their feedback. Explore tip sheets to help navigate terminology and other language considerations. So for example, here, to us LGBTQ plus instead of LGBTQ, right? And that was recent because there was a need to recognize the two-spirited community, the two-spirited from Indigenous communities here on Turtle Island. Black, Indigenous, racialized instead of people of color. So there are some folks that prefer to use Black, Indigenous, racialized instead of people of color. Don't make assumptions. Inform yourself on how a group or person wants to be referred to. Pronouns and words concerning identity are deeply personal and must be respected. And that's why it's important to ask folks what they prefer their pronoun be, right? Don't immediately assume it, or even ethnicity. Don't assume that someone comes from someone else, right? We've heard of microaggressions like, oh, where do you come from, right? Obviously, immediately thinking that that person, because of the way they look, comes from somewhere else. Use inclusive words and ask inclusive languages. Ask inclusive questions. Folks instead of guys. I can't tell you how often I stop people from using guys, but you need to be self-aware. You need to do that work. It can't be up to me to tell you to stop using it. You need to be more reflective in your practice to be inclusive. All right. Well, thank you so much. We've really come to the end of this part of the session. As I mentioned, my colleague Zanna from BCCA will be doing the second part of the session. But as we stop here, we do have some reflection questions for you to think about. So take your time with this, pause the video, take a piece of paper and pen, and really dive deep into what this means to you, right? So what was interesting to you about the discussion points around communication? And what will you do in your communication skills to be more inclusive? How would you change your language? And how will you remain accountable? So take your time here, pause, and think about these questions.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're able to engage in some meaningful reflections related to communication and communication methods. My name is Zanna Ekeroth. My pronouns are she and her, and I'll take you through the rest of this learning module today. And we'll focus on self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is the ability to speak up for yourself and the things that are important to you. Self-advocacy means you're able to ask for what you need and want and tell people about your thoughts and feelings. Self-advocacy means that you know your rights and responsibilities, you speak up for your rights, and you're able to make choices and decisions that affect your life. And with that, I also wanted to take a moment to talk about imposter syndrome and debunking some of its myths, or I will let educator Blair Imani walk us through it.
I'm so excited about this new job. You're probably just a diversity hire. They must have made a mistake. You're not qualified for this. No, I earned this. Let's talk about imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is when you doubt your own skills, talents, abilities, accomplishments, and qualifications. You might feel like a fraud, and you worry that other people will find out that you don't actually deserve what you've earned. It is not a psychological diagnosis and cannot be found in the DSM. Originally introduced in 1978 as the imposter phenomenon and studied in high-achieving women, it has since been found that anyone can experience imposter syndrome. However, people from historically marginalized and systematically excluded communities can experience it because society is often telling us that we don't deserve to achieve, thrive, or even live. You can fight imposter syndrome by working on your own self-validation and affirmation, keeping a record of your accomplishments, and remembering that sometimes it's not a syndrome, it's the consequences of oppression.
Smarter in seconds.
I love what she says during the end. It's not a syndrome, it's the consequences of oppression. A really good reminder for us to keep to ourselves for moments when we are doubting ourselves, and remember that accepting ourselves and advocating for ourselves can be part of fighting bigger systems of oppression. Also closely connected to this is the idea of perfectionism. So let's
I'm so excited about this new job. You're probably just...
Tima Oken writes, as long as we're striving to be perfect according to somebody else's rules, we have less energy to question these rules and to remember what is truly important. Perfectionism is a characteristic of white dominant culture, and it harms all of us. And I can highly relate to this, but often it takes time to see perfectionism for what it is and to identify it. For myself, I remember taking on my first job in Canada after I moved all the way from Sweden. I was super excited, but I was even more so worried about not living up to the expectations. And most of all, I was worried about my English not being good enough. I remember installing language correction platforms on my computer, in secret, of course, and I spent probably half an hour proofreading every email before sending them. Because making language mistakes make me feel like a failure and unworthy of this role that I was offered, or the role that I was working in. To me, I wouldn't be able to be successful at work if my English wasn't perfect. And I valued English as more important than my own first language, and felt that time that I spent reading books in Sweden was just a waste of time. I should be spending on improving my English instead. So for myself, having battled with perfectionism my whole time, I really thought that this behavior of mine in this role was just a personality trait. And it took me years of learning and unlearning to be able to unpack where that really came from. And it's related to internalized colonialism, classism, and other systems of oppression. And as Tema Okun has identified, perfectionism is one of the main characteristics of white dominant culture. It shows up in individual values and behaviors. It shows up in work cultures and social norms where mistakes are seen as a negative reflection of the person who is making them. And perfectionism also pushes the idea of fault finding. It makes us more concerned about how we are perceived by others than the actual impact of our work. So if we can see perfectionism for what it is, a harmful idea of holding ourselves to an unattainable standard, a standard that probably or most often is rooted in things like capitalism, ableism, sexism, and other systems of oppression, we have a lot to win from dismantling those destructive ideas. It will help us flourish as individuals and as communities, and it will contribute to a more equitable and inclusive society as a whole. Because striving to become a better person or a better organization shouldn't come from fear, but from compassion. And the end goal shouldn't be perfection, but a mindset of continued learning and collective growth. So what do we do about this? One of the tactics that you could take is to take the time to celebrate growth and achievements, and even the small ones. So this involves unlearning behaviors of minimizing your own work. Learn how to be proud of yourself and what you have achieved. Practice accepting compliments on your work and believing in the compliments and not responding to them. Yeah, but that wasn't great. Just take them, absorb them. You can also start logging your accomplishments. This can be especially helpful to go back to during moments of doubt or maybe before heading into a job interview. And you can include things like projects that you successfully oversaw at work, ideas that you have brought to life, difficult situations that you managed to resolve in a creative way, new learnings from a DEI workshop that you attended, like this one, or things that your peers or managers have said to you. And remember, when you're logging this, that team achievements are just as important. We don't want this exercise to turn into some kind of individualistic competition. So remember that collective growth of a group that you're working with is just as meaningful to note. And in your worksheet, we have provided a small template just with prompting some ideas on how you can log your own growth and achievements. Another powerful strategy is self-care, and particularly self-care as a radical act of liberation, as defined by Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. In our day-to-day lives, oftentimes self-care has been minimized and a synonym for treating yourself, which under capitalism basically means spending a lot of money on things that might make us feel marginally better. But self-care isn't an expensive face moisturizer. It's more about carving out space where you can heal and grow and thrive and make sense of the world around you and the world inside of you. So this means taking care of things at the source rather than just sugarcoating or band-aiding the symptoms. Self-care is to help you notice and respect your own needs and limits. So respecting oneself, protecting oneself, and prioritizing oneself, which is not an act of selfishness. It is to make sure that we can be our best selves in order to engage in our community and live in reciprocity with the rest of the world. Self-care will look different to everyone. And understanding what's cultivating well-being and what is replenishing your capacity is critical. Again, the dominant idea of self-care with anti-aging face creams and expensive scented candles, all of that is an idea more built on capitalism. And while caring for your body and lighting those candles can be part of a routine that makes us feel good, and it might not be, I'm not saying don't do that at all, but it is important to note that self-care goes much deeper than that. So some examples of that might be building an awareness of emotions and triggers, and building an ability to like nip those strong reactions and escalations like in the bud, understanding the roots and not just taking care of the symptoms. Prioritizing commitment to proactive health, mental health, physical health, community health, mindfulness. It could be exercise, it could be different types of hobbies, engaging in your community, solidarity work, all sorts of things. Also building capacity to say no to things. It is okay to say no and to respect your own boundaries. Mindfulness awareness also means to choose your heart over your head when your mind says yes, but your heart says no. And building the self-acceptance that it is impossible to give 100% to everything. It is okay. We can't give 100% at work every day. We shouldn't. We need to keep some of that percentage for ourselves, for our personal lives. And again, these are just some ideas. Self-care might look different to you. And that's what we're going to get into now. So we would like to invite you to this reflective activity. And you may choose some of the questions that feel most relevant to you at this moment, or answer all of them. And answer in any way or form that works best for you. So the questions that we're asking is, how does perfectionism show up in your work or day-to-day life? What is that perfect ideal you're shooting for? Who set that standard? How can you move away from fault finding and viewing mistakes as failures to practicing acceptance, compassion, and appreciation for yourself and others? Remember, mistakes are opportunities for growth. In fact, if we never make mistakes, we might not even be doing the work. So how can you help change the your mindset away from blame and shame? And how can you practice acceptance and compassion, both to yourself and to the people around you? What replenishes your capacity? When, where, and how do you or can you carve out space for yourself to safely heal and grow? Here, it's important that you cultivate whatever builds your endurance. In order to sustain this work, we must find ways to feel joy in the work. And the last question, how does self-care and community care intersect for you? What role does solidarity play in your individual growth, professionally and personally? With that, I will leave you to it, and I hope you enjoyed this reflection activity. Again, thank you so much for your continued engagement in this virtual training. Take care, and we'll see you shortly.